Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Consortium. In this season of the podcast, one of our 3 rotational hosts will guide you through current challenges faced in arms control. Hosted by either Timothy Wright, Fabian Hinz, or myself, Wolf-Christian Pies, we will cover various timely challenges and issues in the world of arms control. Our podcast will cover topics ranging from new technologies, the diversion of firearms, to missile programs and technologies, or sanctions regimes. So, without further ado, let's get started.
So welcome, everybody. Today I have the great honor to welcome David Albright to our podcast, who's the founder and president of the Institute for Science and International Security and one of the world's leading experts on the Iranian nuclear issue, as well as other issues connected to Iran, such as Iranian drone production in Russia or Iran's chemical weapons efforts. And first, thank you so much, Mr. Albright, for taking the time. It's a great pleasure to have you on the podcast.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
I want to jump right into the topic and ask about the current status of Iran's nuclear program. So what we're seeing right now is a very complex, multifaceted Middle Eastern crisis. And the Iranian nuclear issue, which has always been a very pressing issue in the region, has a little bit receded, but still pops up from time to time, at least for the people who don't focus on the Iranian nuclear program as their main day job. So we often hear speculation about whether Israel could attack Iranian nuclear facilities, whether Iran could change its strategy, about increased enrichment levels. And I would like to ask you, can you give us a brief overview of the current state of the nuclear program of Iran? What is happening and why is it concerning?
On a technical level, they finally mastered the gas centrifuge to enrich uranium. They've installed thousands of what we call these advanced centrifuges that work much better than the ones that essentially what we saw prior to this nuclear deal in 2015. And at the same time, they've been boosting the level of enrichment of their product. And so you think in a civil program like that, they'd only make low enriched uranium, things for reactors, less than 20%. But what they've been doing is instead of concentrating on making the 3 to 5% enriched uranium, which is really what they need for their nuclear power reactors, they continue to enrich it up to 20, and now they go up to 60% enriched. And if you're at 60% enriched, you're 99% of the way to weapon-grade uranium, which is the ideal material for nuclear weapons. And so this program does not look like a civil program. It looks like they're going up the ladder to get toward weapon-grade uranium while not actually making the weapon-grade uranium. And so between the greatly increased centrifuge capacity, these enriched uranium stocks, particularly of 20 and 60%, they've positioned themselves that if they did want to make weapon-grade uranium, they could do it very quickly. Like within a week, they could get enough weapon-grade uranium for a nuclear weapon, and many quantities in a month. And so it creates an edge that they're so close to being able to do it. Will they just do it? And in a sense, we could live with that. But the Mideast has really changed, and about a year ago we started to see signs that they were starting to reevaluate how they thought about their nuclear program and worrying that their traditional deterrents, which really are embedded in the proxies, are the surrounding Israel and the missile force, but started to see indications that those two things are not enough. And in the last year, proxies have been severely damaged in Hamas and Hezbollah. The missile force is not at least what we thought it would be, based on monitoring their own discussions of particularly its accuracy and reliability. And so you have a situation where there's a lot of discussion in Iran to whether they should build nuclear weapons as kind of a final deterrent that they can muster, and we don't know how it'll play out. I should mention the weapon-grade uranium is the long pole in the tent of making nuclear weapons, but there's other poles, too, of making it into a crude device you could test underground, or making it so you could deliver it on a missile. But those time frames have shrunk, too. And so you have a situation where they could move to make weapon-grade uranium quickly. It's not that long, much longer. It's months, but it's in months they could have a crude nuclear explosive device. And now their mindset is shifting to thinking maybe that's what we should do.
So I always remember that Iran had this hedging strategy where it basically pursued as many technological capabilities as it could under civilian cover. And as you mentioned, now it's enriching to higher levels than would actually be necessary for a civilian program. So do you think that Iran is slowly giving up the pretense that everything related to the nuclear program was just civilian in nature?
I think they are. We don't use the term hedging. I understand why people do. I mean, we use a more technical-based assessment. I think they're trying to send a signal that they can build the bomb quickly, and they want to get some deterrence value out of that. I think underneath it is to try to say an Israeli military strike would be pointless. You can't stop us. So I think they're trying to get some value from these statements and try to get in a position where they could convince Israel not to strike. I don't think that'll work, but I think that's what they want to do.
I guess you would see the slight change in rhetoric, or the rather dramatic change in rhetoric we've seen in that light as well. So I remember a time when Iran would always fervently deny they had any ambitions to ever produce nuclear weapons. And now you have former officials saying, oh, it's like, imagine a nuclear weapon is a car. We have the engine, we have the tires, we just have to assemble everything.
Yeah.
So that's probably part of it, right?
Yeah, and one of the complications in all this is that you think, oh, now we'll talk about our former nuclear weapons program. They still maintain the line, we've never worked on nuclear weapons, and they refuse to cooperate with the International Atomic Energy Agency, just trying to get to the bottom of some of that. Just a subset of those questions on former nuclear weapons work. So Iran is very difficult to deal with.
You already mentioned that they could have enough enriched uranium for a nuclear weapon in a very, very short time, potentially a crude nuclear explosive device in a month. So what would your timeline be as a technical expert for a deliverable nuclear weapon? How long would it take them, and how much confidence do you have in that assessment? How many unknowns are there?
Their crash nuclear weapons program in the early 2000s got them to the point where they could make a crude nuclear explosive. In the sense, crude is, it's small. It's, half a meter in diameter. It's using pretty sophisticated systems to initiate the high explosive and then to produce the neutrons at the right moment. But it wasn't ruggedized or really finished to the point of being able to put it on. At that time, it was going to be the Shahed 3 missile. They did quite a few studies, but they had some serious work to do. On the crude, it could be delivered in a truck, plane, ship. So it's not that it's not deliverable, but I don't believe it could really go on a missile. Now, once you get into this area, though, these are not high confidence estimates by any means. And I've had government people, intelligence people in Europe who say, well, you say a year, let's say, to get to a warhead that can be delivered in a missile. I think they can do it in 3 months.
Oh, interesting.
And I stick to my year. There's another estimate, too, which is out there, which was very popular in Israel a couple of years ago, was Iran would only recreate the Ahmad plan, this crash program of the early 2000s, finish it, and then serially produce nuclear warheads for ballistic missiles. And it would take them at least 2 years to do that, to put together the nuclear weapons production infrastructure, finish the work on the warhead for the reentry vehicle, and then serially produce them. And I think their assessment is broader now. I think they understand that it could be a crash program. And that wouldn't be from the nuclear weaponeers. I think the nuclear weaponeers want a predictable task with a clear march forward where they produce something that they have high confidence in. But the leadership may differ. And so if Iran is really put into a corner, they may say, okay, just build the bomb as fast as you can. And that's where we come up with an assessment of about 6 months to get a warhead that could be exploded underground or delivered in this crude way. But significantly longer to get a warhead on a missile. And from my understanding of looking at the documents in this, what we call the nuclear archive, if they're going to fire a missile at Israel, they want to make sure it's going to detonate over a target. They understand it's hard to get through, but also that creates another challenge, which we think they have to wrestle with. And you'll know this better than I. The Shahed 3 had a rather kind of old-fashioned reentry vehicle, old-fashioned shape. Now they're pointier. And that requires further miniaturization of the warhead to get it to fit in. And they're fully capable of doing that, but I do think it takes time.
I mean, that's a very good point. I like the distinction between the technical requirements you would have as a nuclear weaponeer and the requirements the political leadership might have if they just want to test something as quickly as possible. I think that's a really, really important point. Now, when it comes to weaponization, how do you see potential activities going on or never having ceased? Because, of course, the narrative is that Iran in 2003 stopped the Ahmad plan, then did its, let's call it, hedging program, whether one likes the term or not. But as far as I know from your research, there are some indications they continued some research to weaponization relevant aspects in the meantime. And there are also some indications that some of these activities have gained steam in the last few weeks and months.
And some of this was reinforced by looking at what was in this nuclear archive. Is the Ahmad people, including its leader, Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, were less than happy about stopping their effort. And the weaponization was moving much faster than the ability to make weapon-grade uranium. That was several years away. But the leadership did want to not have all these things discovered. And so they did shut it down, but the Ahmad people made sure they could keep staff in place and they could continue things. And what we saw was, and this is now moves into the IAEA IAEA report and some media reporting, they continued work on the neutron initiator at the very center of the device. It's called a uranium deuteride neutron initiator, and they wanted to do some more work. They continued doing some theoretical work. And the way we see it is the actual work can go up and down. It can stop for a while. It can be that they're working on something related that's for non-nuclear military use, but it has benefits. We're less sure if they're making components now, but we were feeling before they weren't actually making the components of the nuclear weapon. They may have some are long-life components, like the neutron initiator. Some are not. I mean, there's been discussion of plastic explosives in this Telegon 2 building, which I'm sure we'll discuss. Plastic explosive has a lifetime of 5 years. Let's say. And so what they made in 2003 is no longer any good. And so we think that overall they weren't actually making a nuclear weapon, but preparing themselves to do it. And if you look at the weapon-grade uranium side, they went from several years down now to a week to get enough, and they can get enough for several in a month. And so they've solved the weapon-grade uranium bottleneck, and we think they've shortened the time to make the nuclear weapon, because I don't think the 6 months, our estimate is predicated on all the work they did in their mod plant. We don't speculate exactly what they accomplished post-Ahmad to now, but just looking at Ahmad, that was a tremendous effort to work on nuclear weapons, and that information and experience was not lost. And so that contributes to the shorter time frame.
So talking about the Toleron 2 site, which you just mentioned, for our listeners, you probably remember the Israeli attack against Iran in October, where we saw Israel strike a number of targets. So we saw them strike solid propellant motor production sites that were used for the production of ballistic missiles, several air defense sites, and also one particular building called Toleron 2 within the wider Parchin military-industrial complex. And we knew this building. You have done quite a bit of research on it. We knew it was connected to the pre-2003 nuclear weapons program. And initially the reporting was that this was a symbolic strike against a historic facility that probably wasn't active anymore. But then we saw some reporting that it was still active. And I would like to know your opinion about this site and what was happening there in 2003 and what was potentially happening there after 2003.
Yeah, Telegon 2 is at a site, relatively small site, where there were high explosive chambers. Mm-hmm. Telegon 1 had the biggest one. It could detonate 50, 60 kilograms of high explosive inside this chamber and contain it. And that was used, we believe, based on the documents, to test the neutron initiator. And then Telegon 2 also had a smaller high explosive chamber, but smaller. And it also had a flash X-ray. Mm-hmm. And so that the documents show that they were testing what's called a shockwave generator, kind of spherical versions of it, smaller than the actual, but nonetheless could be fired and see how it works. And the shockwave generator is a kind of a multi-point initiation system that sets off the high explosive charge. And it does it in a rather innovative way. It's a way to avoid the use of high explosive lenses. Like if you look at models or pictures of the old Trinity device, you see these big, thick slabs or cones or whatever shape of high explosives that were used to create a spherical ingoing shockwave. Could be 32 detonation points. This thing is basically, you can initiate it at one point, and the fuse system works through all these channels and then simultaneously reaches many more than 32 points. And then that would set off the high explosive. And so it's much thinner than what you get with shaped charges, but it has to be tested. And we think the help came from former Soviet nuclear weapons people to get Iran to being able to do this. But nonetheless, you have to test it. And the channels are filled with plastic explosive, and you use plastic explosive because you can mold it. And so at the end of Ahmad, we believe, after Ahmad, we believe that based on the years of sanitization, the activities that Iran pulled out all these high explosive chambers. The IAEA inspectors, or at least the Director General, went in 2015 as part of the implementation of this nuclear deal and saw that the Telegon 1 chamber had been removed. He didn't go to Telegon 2 for reasons we never understood, but we think that chamber and the flash X-ray were removed. So we don't think Ahmad-type activities continued in Telegon 2. And that something else is going on. And we have not gotten to the bottom of it yet, but it's certainly an active effort on our part.
Okay, that's interesting. And talking about Israeli strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, the big elephant in the room is, of course, always the possibility that Israel could decide to strike Iranian nuclear facilities, especially if Iran officially decides to break out and build a deliverable nuclear weapon. And I would like to hear your opinion on whether Israel could actually pull it off. So is this something that Israel could do? I mean, we've seen them do some very successful attacks. There's the Iranian ballistic missile infrastructure, but then again, these are easier targets than the deeply buried underground facilities. What do you think? Whether Israel could do it alone, whether they would need American help, whether that's a realistic possibility?
Sort of assessments based on my own reading of previous strikes by Israel. It's never been possible to go and take out some nuclear sites and then say, we're done. Mm-hmm. You know, Israel hit the Osiris reactor in 1981. Iraq then greatly intensified its work on nuclear weapons, diversified its program into enrichment, and it was only the 1991 war that, in that case, inadvertently stopped it or near stopped it. And then what really ended it was the very intrusive inspection effort. Mm-hmm. And in Syria, the reactor was struck in 2007. We started to see some sort of reconstitution activities in the years afterward, or at least interest in that. And then it was a civil war that stopped it. Mm-hmm. I don't know the status now, but I think the old reactor complex, is not even under Syrian government control. Not that they could use it again. And so I think you have to, if you think of Israel striking Iranian facilities, you have to think of it in kind of a 1-2 punch situation. And so the first punch that Israel could do could cause immense damage to their nuclear program. They have to be very careful what they target, because you don't just bomb everything by any means, and it's a huge amount of facilities and materials. But Israel has very good intelligence, and that they would have to be very selective about their sites and aim to, first of all, make it so they can't make weapon-grade uranium in a week. That may not be 100% assured, but nonetheless, and let me just add, Fordow is more vulnerable than I think people realize. I mean, we have the building designs. It's in the nuclear archive. Israel has even more of those designs. Know exactly how the tunnels go, where they start, how they zig and zag, where the ventilation system is, the power supplies, and without it, you don't have to bring down the roof of the enrichment hall to put that facility out of operation for a long time and make it very hard to get into. And even we're surprised by there's only one ventilation shaft.
Oh, really?
For the building. And you see it in the drawings. We went back and looked at historical imagery, and we could see it being built and then camouflaging it. You know exactly where it is. I mean, there's these movies where they drop something down a ventilation shaft and destroy the facility. There are filtration systems in there, so you're not going to get something all the way down. But you can destroy that shaft pretty deeply that could potentially cause damage, mostly through temperature effects. But you could put the facility out of commission for quite a long time, measured probably in a few years rather than a few months. But that being said, what are you going to do next? And either there has to be a really resounding nuclear deal that puts huge constraints, like what was done in the past on the nuclear program, or you have to be able to say, look, if you rebuild, we will destroy something. It's going to be much more painful. Because in the end, they could give up their entire nuclear program that's involved in enrichment, and they wouldn't suffer anything. It provides no economic benefit at all. Some employment, but that's about it. What if they destroy their oil production facilities and they can't produce oil products for their own population? Or, God forbid, they would go after the exporting part of the oil industry in Iran. So they have to have something that says to Iran that you can suffer much worse consequences if you rebuild. And I think ultimately everyone would like to end up in a nuclear deal, but you could also end up in a situation where Iran just drags its feet on rebuilding out of fear of suffering immense damage, direct damage to its economy. And I think all this Israel could do on its own. But yeah, it's just that the U.S. provides so much military support that the United States has to buy into this. Yeah. And there's so much interlinkage via communication and intelligence that the United States would definitely be involved in some way that's fairly direct. It may not be hitting Iran militarily, but definitely supporting the mission.
I mean, it's really interesting if you look at the last Israeli strikes. I think Iran has never been under any illusion that it could stop an Israeli or even an American airstrike, but they always had the idea that they could deter them through their missile and proxy arsenal. And now that that deterrence has been degraded, there's really not a lot to stop an actor that is really intent on striking Iran and striking critical Iranian assets from doing so. So I think it will be really interesting whether actors in the region will make the choice. But that leads me to my next question in terms of whether Israel would attack if Iran decides to build a nuclear weapon. Would Iran actually decide to build a nuclear weapon? So what is the current Iranian strategy now? We're seeing a bit of conflicting signals, I would say, in terms of former officials openly talking about the possibility of building a nuclear weapon, some activities resuming, enrichment going up, new centrifuges going up. But at the same time, some Iranian officials talking about a potential new deal about the nuclear program. So is this a strategy to get a new deal and to increase leverage when negotiating a future deal? Is this a strategy to perhaps further develop nuclear capabilities and just buy time? Or is the Iranian regime internally conflicted? Do you have any good reading on what people in Tehran and the relevant decision makers are thinking?
No, we don't have good reading on what the centerpiece of the Iranian decision-making apparatus is thinking. We know people who speak on TV or members of parliament are reflecting that they're not speaking for it. But what we see is probably all of what you said. And I would add the people in Iran understand the downsides of building nuclear weapons in the sense they're going to immediately have to worry about what Saudi Arabia does. Egypt is not going to stand still. Track two things they've always said: we'll tolerate Israel's nuclear weapons, but we'll never tolerate Iran's without us going for it. So I think Iranian decision makers understand that this is not the best path to go down, but nonetheless, they very well may decide to do that. And there were many in Washington thinking, well, Iran will go for the bomb before Trump takes office. They'll use this transition time. And Trump sometimes does things that are productive, and that by having this report that Elon Musk met with the Iranian ambassador to the UN talking about a deal creates a countercurrent against pressures to build a bomb that says, well, maybe we can get a good deal from Trump. And Trump, in the end, is not a very good negotiator. Basically, he just badgers people and bullies them until they just say, I'll take it, just leave me alone. But that doesn't work internationally, as was demonstrated with his effort to constrain the North Korean nuclear program. And so I think the Iranians probably feel they could out-negotiate him. And so I think it's created this countercurrent that would argue inside Iran that, well, let's wait and see what happens. We can always decide to build the bomb. But if we move too quick, we may miss potentially useful deal.
I mean, as you say, Trump is a bit of a wild card, and he has these kind of contradicting urges to put pressure on his opponents, but also showing a fundamental willingness to do deals. Question is whether it gets transformed into some constructive policy. And here my question would be, what would you expect from a Trump presidency? I understand you've just returned from DC and probably got a bit of a feeling for the mood in DC. Would a Trump presidency start with attempts to reach a deal immediately, or would it first be a maximum pressure campaign, as we've seen before, or maximum pressure campaign that is accompanied by attempts to get a deal, or is all of that still completely unknown?
I think he's moving much quicker than last time, much quicker. And he's putting in place in the National Security Council people who are going to take a very hard line on Iran and want to reconstitute. Basically, it'd be sanctions enforcement as a priority. There's always more sanctions you can apply, but the problem is the enforcement, and they'll want to drive down oil production. And I think that's going to happen. I think they also want to do more to try to disrupt the supply chain for its missile and nuclear program, and there's a lot of room to run there. So I think Iran should expect that to take place. But other forces want to disengage from the Middle East, and or they want to settle this in some way and have a deal. So I think that'll be played out, but I don't quite see how that's going to happen. Elon Musk is not going to be a negotiator. He may be a facilitator, but the actual negotiation is a different process. And I hope Trump's learned from the last administration is that he needs to listen to his planners. One of the problems in 2018, I mean, we understood Trump hated the deal, but if you're going to leave it and leave it suddenly, you should have a plan in place. And their plan was to maximum pressure. And literally, I went to briefings where the top people said to me, oh, Iran won't build up its nuclear program. And we just sort of look at him and go, oh, okay, that's your plan. Okay. We can punish them as much as we want and they do nothing. And some of that reflected that there was a pretty dramatic policy reversal from what had been planned for the first administration. And so I'm hoping that they do something to reimpose enforcement and various other things as part of a maximum strategy, that they've put in place what they want in a negotiation. And they did that prior to the withdrawal. I mean, we knew quite clearly what is it that mattered to get in a negotiation. It's more than what Obama got. I mean, obviously, these are not friends of the deal, but it was things like the IA has to say to us questions. Really, we've gotten to the bottom of it with Iran, and they're cooperating. I mean, that would be one of the key things. The other would be more consistent with the JPOA, sharp limits in the enrichment capacity. But they really have to figure out what they want out of the negotiations. And also after 2018, they reverted to, I don't know if you remember this sort of 12-point or 12 demands. It was almost like 1968 in Paris. We have 12 non-negotiable demands, which I guess in French means questions or requests. I mean, in English, it becomes demand. But it's in the pre-2018 environment, 3 of those 12 were fall on your sword for. 6 were, okay, maybe we can get mostly limits on Hamas or Hezbollah. But, the other, what does that make? 3, we really want to get something substantial, but we're not going to fall on our sword to get it. And then after 2018, they all, as I said, become, everyone needs to be there. So they need, and I hope they're doing this, trying to put together their strategy for accomplishing things while they get tough. And I think they'll give a much freer hand to Israel. I don't think they want Israel to attack, but if Israel decides something needs to be done, they'll be very sympathetic. And in fact, I should mention one of the twists in all this that wasn't there is recent, is this idea that people from the old Ahmad plan working for this entity, SP&D, which is this kind of military research and development organization that grew out of Ahmad and would probably build the bomb itself. Some of the people are working at old Ahmad facilities. And that's one of the questions at Taliban too. Is some of that activity happening? Was it happening at Taliban too? But they're working on things that are related to high explosive work, could be nuclear weapons related. I mean, in the end, the intelligence community doesn't know what's going on inside these facilities on a day-to-day basis, but they know that something is suspicious is happening. And what's interesting is that those people don't have the approval of the top leadership, that it's kind of self-initiated work that is picking up and that's muddying the line in this whole question of, has Iran decided to build the bomb? And a lot of this certainty in intelligence communities that we discussed things with was that they would know that based on changes in the activities of the top leadership. But now you have this, self-initiative programs at the bottom that are reducing the timelines potentially.
I mean, that's quite interesting, having self-initiative for nuclear weapons-related work. That's quite a unique model, I would say, for development. But coming back to the US real quick, one thing that would be really interesting for me and probably for our listeners is also, do you still think that the Iranian nuclear issue is as much as a partisan issue as it used to be? Because I remember when I was in the US back in the day, of course, the JCPOA was Obama's legacy project for transforming Middle East policy to some extent. And then Trump very abruptly pulled out of the deal. And I remember how much it became a partisan issue, but a lot has changed in the meantime. If you look at the protests inside Iran, October 7th, the whole Middle East crisis, do you still think it is very much a partisan issue the way it used to be in, let's say, 2018, 2019, 2020?
I hope not. I mean, I don't know. And it wasn't before 2014. And sanctions legislation had opposed by Obama administration certainly didn't do anything to block him and then signed on to him. But it's hard to judge right now because a lot of depend is, does the Trump resistance movement reconstitute itself? So far, not. Yeah, there was obviously very bitter debates on the JCPOA, and we got caught up in the middle of them. And then after Trump won and wanted to move in a different direction, but not leave the deal, the Trump resistance that existed in the Democratic Party said nothing can be done with Trump. Doesn't matter what it is. Total resistance to anything he suggests in Congress. And you couldn't even get the Democrats to negotiate on legislation that would institutionalize an approach. One of the things that's changed in Washington this time is the Trump resistance movement doesn't seem coming together in the same way as it did in Trump's first term. And so, again, these are big political issues, and we work on this small area of Iran. But if this is done badly, it could lead to a region-wide war. So one hopes that the bipartisan approach wins out.
That's quite interesting. So quite a change of mood from back in the day.
Yeah.
Now, we talked a lot about the US, and of course, there's also some other diplomatic activity going on with the IAEA and the European Union. How do you see the current developments taking place there, and how consequential you think they are in the grander scheme of things?
I think they're very important. I mean, let me say, happiest moments was when I could work on the inspection effort in Iraq in the 90s and work with people at the IAEA. They'd gone from just being miserable inspection system to being a remarkably good one. And anything could be tried in the context of Iraq because of the strength of the UN Security Council resolution that created this whole effort. I have very dear feelings toward the IAEA, and I think their work in Iran is critical. Mm-hmm. And as I mentioned, in the Trump administration, that was one of the three things they'd fall on their sword for, is the IAEA gets to do what it does and really says this is a peaceful nuclear program and the questions have been answered. And so I think their work is very important. They've sounded the alarm in Iran having undeclared nuclear material. And the central mandate of the IAEA in these kind of cases, in fact, in general, is that they get a declaration that's complete. Obviously, it has to be correct. That's pretty easy to deal with. If they say they have this much uranium, you can just check. But is it the complete amount of uranium? And that's the tricky part, and Iran has failed on that. And so the IAEA has been sounding the alarm that they're not telling the whole truth, actually lying about important things. And so now the question is, will the international community use that information? And I think the Europeans and the United States are determined that the IAEA alarm should be answered with action. Now, Biden's people have been fairly timid, and when they're more timid than the E3, France and Germany, it's a pretty scary thing. But nonetheless, they've moved forward and said to Iran that this is serious. And I think the end point of this could be that now the IAEA has to prepare a report in the next couple of months on what they've found. Mm-hmm. They found undeclared nuclear material at 4 former Ahmad sites. Mm-hmm. And then found some other, what looks to be undeclared uranium through some accounting procedures. And after that report, the next step would be snapback of sanctions under the nuclear deal, which would be a severe blow to Iran. But the other side of it is a very senior Iranian official just recently said the IAEA cannot demand that we do these things out of the blue, but which really shows you what the lack of understanding in Iran, mm-hmm. at least in parts of its leadership, are obligations under their safeguards agreement, which is at the heart of Iran's commitment as a member of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. So they signed up to do these things. They're not negotiating positions that you can play around with. They said, we will provide a complete declaration, and they signed it. It's not negotiable, but part of the problem is Iran thinks that all of this is negotiable, and the IAEA say, no, it's not. And it's incumbent upon the U.S. and the E3 in particular to back the IAEA up fully.
Do you think there's a good chance of snapback of sanctions at the current point in time?
I think if there's no negotiations, I think very good chance it'll happen. The opportunity to do that ends next October. Mm-hmm. And so it's either now or never. And so I think there's something significant would have to happen in a positive way from the E3 position to keep them from one of them doing it. The European sense that I hear anyway is that if the comprehensive report comes out, mm-hmm. there's no reaction from Iran in a positive way, there's no serious negotiations for a deal, that then they would snap back. And in the end, it is literally just resetting to 2015 mm-hmm. and having the missile embargo reimposed. The enrichment program would be viewed as violating international law. And then you could just build up pressure more effectively, more internationally rather than U.S.-based, and then go from there. Again, try to get a deal, but try to do it from a position of more strength.
One other question I have regards the international dimension. So now we're living in an era where Iranian drones come crashing down in Europe every day. We had the delivery of thousands of Shahed drones to Russia, which your institute, of course, have covered in detail. And we had the reported delivery of Iranian ballistic missiles. And the question is always, what will Iran get in return? Could it be missile technology, air defense technology, or could it be something in the nuclear field as well? And I would like to hear your opinion on what Russia could give Iran in the nuclear field, or is that even a realistic prospect, or is that something that Russia just wouldn't touch? How concerned should we be when it comes to the alignment of Iran and Russia, especially with its potential implications for the nuclear field?
Yeah, I think Russia gives a lot to Iran on nuclear. I mean, the power plant that exists there, the Bushehr reactors, Russian, huge amount of assistance in terms of getting things to work better, safer, that's been going on for years. And even what's going on during the JCPOA times, that some of that was encouraged. And that spilled over to Iran being able to build reactors much more effectively. Now, they're focusing on much smaller ones, but one is third the size of Bushehr, and they're putting together the infrastructure to be able to make the parts. Mm-hmm. So I think there's been a tremendous transfer already. Now, I personally think Russia will not want to transfer enrichment technology. I mean, it's very proud of what it's done in Russia. It has the leading centrifuge program in the world. It was the first program of that nature. And its people are pretty disciplined not to help outsiders. So I would not believe the Russian government at this point in time would help. Although I do have to remember that they did offer to sell Iran an enrichment plant back during the Clinton administration. And Clinton administration stopped that. But I think right now, I don't think they would see the benefit in marginal help to what's a pretty successful Iranian centrifuge program. On weaponization, there's already been leakage out of the Soviet nuclear weapons complex. And I would hope Russia would not in any way play in that playground. But I do think where they more than happy to help, although I haven't seen evidence of it, maybe you have, is on the space launch program. They can help there, and then Iran can benefit and spin it off into the weapons side, but it would be a space launch cooperation. Now, we wonder, and probably more than suspect, that the improvements that Russia's made in the Shahed drones has gone back to Iran. Russia would identify problems in the drones. And so we think in that interchange, the Russian improvements did go back to Iran. And so Iran can make a better Shahed. And some of it was in the airframe, some of it's in the program of various electronic modules. And we also know Russia's opened the door to Iran to go visit the companies in their military production complex to try to negotiate things. And what we saw in leaked documents was efforts to get the technology for the production technology of a whole range of weapons, from RPGs to parts of old aircraft that they got from the U.S. to TELs to missile defense things. Russia's allowed them to buy things, and they're probably not applying robust export controls to this stuff. And now Russia and Iran have this 25-year cooperation agreement, and so I think there's definitely going to be a range of things going to Iran, and I'd say there's certainly some very advanced missile defense systems that could potentially go. But also I think Iran's very interested in getting hold of the technology so they can create the factories to make these things themselves.
But all more on the conventional side of things.
Yeah, so far. I think I've seen this in other programs. You think, there'll be some cooperation. But if you're sitting in Iran's nuclear weapons program, which is ultra secret, and you know that if it gets exposed, it could lead to an Israeli strike within days, you don't necessarily want to bring Russians in on that, because ultimately you don't know how this is going to end up. It all looks great now, but roll forward 6 months or so, and it may be that Russia decides to tell a U.S. ally, thinking that this isn't great for the Middle East if Iran really has a more effective nuclear weapon, and they may rat him out. So I think the Iranians probably would not want to bring the Russians in on the nuclear weaponization program. And we do think that there was Russian-Iranian cooperation on making stable isotopes in the IR-1 centrifuges, these old-fashioned ones. And I believe that Iran probably got help from individual Russians on how to make their centrifuge work better, because probably the Russians were frustrated that the thing doesn't work very well, and they're trying to really make stable isotopes, and they may have very well given the Iranians some hints or tricks to get the thing to work better.
I mean, that's quite interesting because it mirrors what I'm seeing in the missile program. I mean, a lot of people focus on the transfer of large Chinese systems or special technologies, but a lot of times the more critical kind of support is just experts arriving to troubleshoot, people with experience.
Yeah.
Something that doesn't also require the Iranians to change everything and how they're doing it. Their whole structures, the whole processes allows the Iranians to retain a lot of agency over the program. So I guess it would be similar in that case as well.
Yeah, but I think on advanced centrifuge, I think the Iranians are going to have a tougher time with the Russians. There's no obvious interplay right now where they can exchange. But anything is possible depending on how this war goes and how Putin really thinks about the future. So it's certainly something to worry about. And I think I would hope the Trump administration, if they do decide to seek a deal, that part of it would be to split Iran off from the Russians and Chinese to a certain extent.
Makes sense. So I have one final question, if you don't mind. I decided to keep the most difficult question for the end.
Oh, no.
And that is, how would the Iranian nuclear file look like after Khomeini? So what would the future Iranian position be? Of course, we don't know. We don't know who's going to succeed Khomeini. We don't know how the Iranian government is going to look like. But when talking to governments, do you get an impression that people prepare for this day and have strategies already in place?
It's not something we can work on that directly. I think there's hope that the new person would decide that it's important to change the trajectory in some way. But what we see is more of a preparation by the Iranian Supreme Leader's office to guarantee the next person is like him. It was some modifications, but essentially would carry on the legacy of the current Supreme Leader. But it looks like the preparations are being put in place that radical change wouldn't depend on misjudging one individual that may take the top leadership. So I'm not very hopeful that much would change. But again, the other part of me is really hoping, because the thing is, this crisis has gone on for so long, and let me call it a crisis from the nuclear technical point of view, and it always is getting worse. And that I think the hope, obviously, is on a more realistic level, is that the U.S. can manage to cobble together something that both scares the regime, whoever is heading it, and rewards the regime enough to create a better situation for all.
Well, let's hope for the best. But first, thank you so much for these insights. That was really valuable. I would have a ton of questions, but we're already running out of time. But thanks once again for deciding to appear on our podcast. It was a pleasure.
No, and thank you for very educated and probing questions. So really appreciate that. One of the downsides in the work I do is I rarely interact with people outside of my organization. I mean, we really get insular, so appreciate this opportunity to talk to someone outside my group.
That was fantastic.
So that's all we have time for today. So thank you so much to our guest for sharing expertise and knowledge with us. And thank you all for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. For more information, visit the IISS website. And as always, be sure to follow the IISS on Twitter and LinkedIn, where IISS analysts will be sharing the insights and quick takes. You can find more information on the topics discussed in today's episode in our show notes. Please do follow, rate, and subscribe to the Arms Control Poser wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts to keep up to date with all the latest episodes. Thank you, and until next time.